Hello everyone! Since the Switch 2 and Mario Kart World are releasing today, I wanted to talk about something that I've gotten a lot of comments about in the past few months, which is whether we'll ever be able to mod Mario Kart World. In case you're not aware, I've previously made videos where I explained the modding process of Mario games on their release day, and I've also created a number of Mario Kart 8 Deluxe custom tracks. So I think it makes sense for me to discuss the potential of modding Mario Kart World. Of course, this is a bit of a ridiculous thing to talk about the day a new console comes out, because obviously nobody's figured out how to homebrew the Switch 2 yet, and that's actually what I want to talk about first, because there are several big things that need to happen sequentially before Mario Kart World modding becomes viable. So will it be possible to homebrew the Switch 2? I should preface this section of the video by saying I'm not a programmer or a homebrewing expert, but this is by far the biggest obstacle to Mario Kart World modding, so I'm going to talk about it. Due to the popularity of Nintendo as a brand, and by extension Nintendo game emulation and modding, homebrew enthusiasts have historically found exploits for most Nintendo consoles not that long after each console's release. In the case of the original Switch, it took around a year for a hardware-based exploit to be found that was actually impossible for Nintendo to patch using software updates. Of course, that didn't stop them from patching the exploit regardless by releasing all their newer Switch units with an updated chip that had the exploit removed, so it's impossible to homebrew these newer Switch models without physically modifying their internal hardware. That's what makes the possibility of Switch 2 homebrewing somewhat questionable, because Nintendo has been shutting down and trying to prevent homebrewing and emulation more than ever in the past few years. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Switch 2 is more secured against exploits than any previous Nintendo console. And even if an exploit is found, Nintendo recently updated their user agreement to mention the possibility of them disabling your account and bricking your console if they detect any console modification shenanigans. However, I also think it's difficult to overestimate the tenacity of Nintendo homebrew enthusiasts. Despite all the game pricing stuff and other controversies that have surrounded the Switch 2, I think it's undeniable that there is a lot of hype surrounding the console. I believe Nintendo is more popular and its community bigger and more widespread than ever before, and that popularity should translate to a large amount of knowledgeable people trying everything they can to get past the Switch 2's security. So even if the console is nearly impossible to get into through traditional methods, I would be very surprised if hackers don't eventually find a viable exploit for the Switch 2. Although the user agreement console shutdown thing is scary on the surface, it's basically just an extension of something Nintendo has been doing for years now, which is banning homebrewed Switch users online. So just like with homebrewed Switch 1 units, I assume keeping a homebrewed Switch 2 offline should be enough to circumvent this practice. Alright, so let's say the Switch 2 does get homebrewed. What else needs to happen before something like Mario Kart World modding becomes viable? Well, we will almost certainly need custom Switch 2 firmware to get around Nintendo's security, and in order to start modding, game dumping and mod loading applications would also need to be made. And even if the game files can be dumped and loaded as a mod, we'll need software that can actually edit Mario Kart World's files to make that worthwhile. That relates to another question going into Switch 2 modding as a whole, because we have no idea how consistent game engines and file systems will be between Switch 1 and Switch 2 games. Nintendo has generally been pretty iterative when it comes to how their first-party games process, compress, and store data, meaning a single fan-made tool like Killzx Gaming's Switch Toolbox can be used to edit files for a variety of game engines spanning a variety of recent Nintendo consoles. So although we will have no way of knowing for sure until game dumping becomes possible, I think it's likely that first-party Switch 2 games will have a similar internal structure to previous Nintendo titles, which should make tool development way more feasible thanks to pre-existing documentation. Okay, so with all that vaguely technical stuff out of the way, let's talk about Mario Kart World. People haven't really been asking me, will Mario Kart World modding be possible, but more something along the lines of, will making Mario Kart World custom tracks be possible? So that's what I'll be trying to answer. The distinction between those questions is noteworthy because obviously the big thing about Mario Kart World is how it drastically changes the implementation of racetracks into the wider game structure. One of the appealing things about Mario Kart custom track creation to me has always been how each track can be treated as a self-contained project. Whereas it takes at least a handful of individual levels to make a decently sized 2D Mario mod, for example, a custom track is completely separate from all the other tracks. You see what I'm getting at here, right? Because with Mario Kart World, that separation is gone. Not only is each track in Mario Kart World located on the same landmass, but the structure of every track can also dynamically adapt to whichever route the player chooses to take throughout the world. Tracks are no longer fundamentally a loop or a linear route, but an interconnected grid of possible paths for drivers to take, similar to the Tour City tracks in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe's Booster Course Pass. So when it comes to working with this system, either you're willing to ignore it entirely and put your custom track off on some floating island in the sky, or any potential custom track will need to be integrated into this pre-existing structure. Unless you're ambitious enough to try to make a fully custom world map consisting of multiple custom tracks, assuming that's something that we'll even be able to do. And that's the thing, right? Because I'm saying all of this as if we know whether editing these tracks and the way they connect to the open world environment around them will even be possible at all. For all we know, these integrations are basically hard-coded into the game. However, I'm actually pretty sure that won't be the case. I think it's natural for people to assume that every amazing new gimmick Nintendo comes up with for their latest game is made up of some crazy, complicated underlying system that will be difficult for modders to decipher. For example, I remember when Super Mario Bros. Wonder first came out, loads of people asked me whether editing Wonder effects, or even just implementing existing Wonder effects into custom levels, would ever be possible. But the reality is that making complicated systems like Wonder effects easy to use during development requires the implementation of this kind of gimmick to be flexible. So I think it's at least plausible that that will also apply to Mario Kart World's variable track structure. That doesn't change the fact that the disconnectedness of individual custom track projects that I mentioned earlier is gone for good though. So whereas it has generally been the norm for custom track collections for previous Mario Kart games to consist of a selection of uncoordinated mods made by separate people, I think it's likely that, assuming Mario Kart World's custom track creation will be possible and popular, custom track collection mods for the game will need to be a coordinated team effort in the same way traditional Mario level pack mods usually are, for example. Okay, but before we get ahead of ourselves, let's say the community has overcome all of these hurdles. The Switch 2 can be homebrewed, modding tools have been developed, Mario Kart World's unique track structure has been figured out. Will custom track creators actually be able to match the visual quality of Mario Kart World? Well, let's talk about the game's graphics, and this will be a bit of a tangent. Over the past few months, I've occasionally seen people argue that Mario Kart World doesn't represent a significant graphical leap over Mario Kart 8, which would be kind of silly considering that game came out 11 years and 2 console generations ago. On the surface, and without any game development insight, I can totally see what people mean by this though. First of all, Mario Kart World leans into the typical cartoony Mario art style way more than Mario Kart 8 did, and whether you're a fan of this or not is completely subjective. Also, that cartoony art style doesn't lend itself to the typical kinds of visual features that people associate with next generation 4K graphics or whatever. And indeed, the game uses Nintendo's traditional visual techniques, such as baked environmental shadows as opposed to real-time or even ray-traced ones. So if we ignore Mario Kart World's more lively character animations, improved visual effects, physics-based object interactions, higher quality skyboxes, etc., yeah, the game's environments basically look in line with Mario Kart 8. But that's exactly what I think is impressive about Mario Kart World, because keeping this similarity in visual fidelity in mind, the scope of these two games is basically incomparable. Like I talked about earlier, each Mario Kart 8 track is a self-contained area, and that is precisely what allows them to look as good as they do. Do you think it's a coincidence that all of Nintendo's best-looking games take place in smaller individual play areas as opposed to massive open worlds? Sure, visual features close to the drivers look nice in Mario Kart 8, but assets that can only ever be seen from far away can be rendered more primitively without most people likely realizing. For example, the game uses a lot of fully 2D assets for faraway background details, which is really difficult to notice in-game in most cases unless you know what you're looking for. This also extends to the game's foliage. Mario Kart 8 makes use of a lot of oddly realistic 2D renders for bushes and trees, which only sort of work because of the game's control over the angles at which the player sees these assets. Compare that to Mario Kart World, which features more typical cartoony foliage, which works from every angle. I think the only example of this 2D asset corner cutting not working out at all in Mario Kart 8 is these cardboard looking crowd areas, which incidentally Mario Kart World also got rid of. In general, I don't think Mario Kart World uses any fully 2D or lower poly assets, because most of its areas aren't self-contained and thus can't be designed around what the player can and can't see up close. Whereas distant features like these mountains would almost certainly be fully 2D in Mario Kart 8, in Mario Kart World you can drive right up to them, and therefore they're fully 3D and just as detailed as any other part of the world. In all fairness, the game does make use of LOD pop-in to dynamically switch between lower and higher quality models for assets depending on how close they are to the driver, but my point still stands. The fact that Mario Kart World can even compare to 8 in terms of visual fidelity whilst rendering all this open world stuff speaks to the power of the Switch 2. It actually makes more sense to compare Mario Kart World to other open world games like the recent Zelda or Xenoblade games, and in that light I think it's clear that Mario Kart World's visuals are impressive. Okay, but let's get back to the topic at hand, because this is a good thing for the potential of custom Mario Kart World tracks. I think it's undeniable that conventional AAA video game graphics are at a point now where it's hard for even a very talented modder to be able to keep up, at least compared to 10 or 20 years ago. So I have to say, the prospect of Nintendo developing games with that kind of visual fidelity is something that I've been kind of scared of for the past few years, because that would be a huge blow to the accessibility of modding Nintendo games. Therefore, the fact that Mario Kart World tracks aren't ridiculously detailed or filled with visual attributes that are difficult for amateurs to replicate is great news for us modders. Sure, average track assets probably feature more polygons and higher quality textures now, and of course that same high quality background detail rule will also need to apply to custom tracks, but I think all of that is manageable. To end off this video, I just want to quickly run through some miscellaneous modding related things I've noticed about Mario Kart World. I'm interested to see how the wall riding mechanic is implemented under the surface, considering the way Mario Kart 8 handles collision wouldn't remotely work with a feature like this. In fact, it is funny how Nintendo themselves are clearly playing fast and loose with collision to make wall riding in certain spots more accessible. I wonder if other innocuous track elements also completely lack collision like this. Apart from this wall riding gimmick, the game doesn't seem to feature any traditional anti-gravity, though the way Mario Kart 8's camera works during anti-gravity sections has seemingly been carried over. If you've ever wondered why Mario Kart 8's camera can be such a janky mess outside of anti-gravity sections, but is usually pretty smooth during all these twists and turns, that's because the game only allows for the angle of the camera to be changed dynamically when anti-gravity is turned on, for some reason. But thankfully, I think it's pretty clear that Mario Kart World either features pre-programmed camera adjustments in sections with angled road surfaces, or uses a camera that automatically adjusts for this kind of stuff. I'm also interested to see how the movement limits of the airplane transformation sections are handled, because these don't seem to follow along one specific path in the way Mario Kart 8's glider sections do. How Mario Kart World handles its variable route structure whilst avoiding the confusion of Tour's city tracks is really clever, because the game seems to feature loads of track objects that get placed alongside roads dynamically to make the intended route during intermission track segments very clear. I wonder how customizable these dynamic roadside elements are. The fact that the shock now affects any given track's weather for some time is also interesting. Does each material have separate settings for this shiny rain lighting, or is this handled automatically by just decreasing roughness across the board? Okay, I think I might be running out of things to say that aren't super niche like that, so we better wrap this video up. Overall, I'd say I'm fairly confident that Mario Kart World modding will eventually be a thing. Assuming the game will be well received and extremely popular in the same way most Mario Kart games have been, I just can't imagine that this will be the one game in the franchise that ambitious modders won't eventually be able to crack. unless Switch 2 homebrewing truly doesn't end up being a thing, but I don't really think I have the expertise or knowledge to be able to assess that with any certainty. Either way, for now I'm just super excited to get my hands on the game, so that's gonna do it for this video, guys. If you enjoyed, maybe consider leaving a like or a comment or subscribing or whatever. You can also sign up for a channel membership to get early access to my videos, and I also have a Discord server linked in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and bye bye!